Having received an MA in government from Harvard University and a BA in English and American Culture Studies from Washington University in St. Louis, Kierstan Kaushal-Carter is now a fourth-year doctoral student in African and African American Studies at Harvard University, where she is writing about policing in the 21st century. Her published writing can be found in the St. Louis Anthology and the New Republic magazine. Kierstan will be in conversation with Mikki Kendall, who is a writer, a cultural critic, and a diversity consultant, and I'm quoting her, putting this in air quotes, occasional feminist. She speaks and writes on feminist history and race, as well as on police violence and contemporary culture. Her work has been published in The Guardian, The Washington Post, and NBC News, among others. She has appeared on the BBC, NPR, The Daily Show, and PBS. She is also the author of the graphic novel Amazons, Abolitionists and Activists. Mikki and Kierstan, thank you so much for being with us this evening at the library. I'm going to just spotlight you. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. If you're on the East Coast like I am, East Coast, or in the evening if you happen to be in Paris like Alice. I can. Very jealous. Very.
I'm in the Midwest right now. All we have is snow. It's all we got right now.
Yes, I'm in Boston, and a couple of weeks ago we got 2 feet of snow, and it's still like working its way down. So very much wish I was in Paris right now, but happy to be in conversation with you, Mikki, and happy to be sharing the space with the rest of our participants. I have a few questions that I kind of have thought of. Having read the book, I first heard about this book when it was first published, maybe in 2020. I have a friend who's a professor of gender studies, and she read the book and she was like, I think this needs to be on all introductory gender studies classes. You know, I remember people reading this book and being like, this is like a thing we all need to be paying attention to. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have read it and to be talking to you about it. So I want to start where you start, which is on the question of solidarity. So I'm curious what kinds of interactions you're thinking about when you're looking to critique solidarity. And as kind of like background for this question, for those of you who are tuning in and have read it, like I'm sure this will resonate with you, that the style and the tone of Hood Feminism like so strongly reminds me of Bell Hooks's famous 1984 volume, Feminist Theory from Margins to Center. And in that book, Hooks has an essay about sisterhood, where she's basically critiquing, I think, a lot of the things that Mikki Kendall is trying to draw our attention to, but for her historical moment. So Hooks is interested in the ways in which like sisterhood, or the idea of sisterhood, is employed by mainstream feminists as a way of evasion, as a way of abdicating responsibility for the ways in which white women in particular perpetuate sexism, racism, classism. But Hooks eventually wants to endorse solidarity as an antidote to sisterhood. Obviously, we're now talking about 40 years after Hooks's essay, and unfortunately after her passing in December. And so I just am curious for you, Mikki, like what is solidarity? What does it look like? And why is it still for you such a freighted and difficult like a concept to try to engage with, and one that you think maybe ultimately want to do away with?
So one of the things, and this is a really mundane example, I'm going to explain it this way and then we're going to go forward, is that a lot of times when the calls for solidarity happen, it is always in the context of what will serve the person asking for solidarity, not necessarily what is going to serve the greater community. And that depends on the person asking. But here's my example. Like I said, it's a really mundane example. So some years ago, my older child's school was having one of those PTA/messy town hall meetings about how they were changing the way that English as a second language was being taught, right? Parents are debating and discussing. Some of the parents whose children were in the ESL group were talking about how important it was for them, for their kids to be able to learn in the language they spoke at home, math and all of these other things, because these skills are easier to acquire that way. And this white mom, who previously had been very big on being a feminist and wore shirts that said she was a feminist, she was doing a lot, gets up and starts talking about how important it is to her that her kids keep learning Spanish from their friends. And I was like, okay. And then she starts looking at other parents who are on her side in the context of our kids not being in the ESL classrooms. And, you know, right, isn't that important to you? And I was like, if I want my kids to learn a second language, I'll pay for them to take lessons. And then we had a moment about like her perception of my lack of solidarity and my perception that she had not even engaged with the concept of solidarity so much as she was being selfish, right? And I know that is a really mundane story, but you see a lot of those kinds of mundane interactions around bigger issues, right? So when we're talking about school closures, that's suddenly not a feminist issue. When we're talking about homelessness or poverty or hunger, well, those are human issues. Those aren't necessarily feminist issues. But women and their communities are the ones being affected, and poverty disproportionately affects people who identify as femme, who identify as women. So like, let's really have that conversational moment. So when I am talking about the craft of solidarity, suddenly it's a feminist issue when it revolves around reproductive rights, particularly for white women in places like Texas, right? We saw all of those calls. And if you went and you looked at the voting in Texas, who voted for that governor and that leadership, overwhelmingly, it was some of the same white women who are now saying, well, wait a minute, we need support. And it doesn't mean we should abandon the other people living there whose reproductive rights were in danger, but it does mean that when we're talking about solidarity, if you can't conceive of it until the trouble is knocking at your door, you're not so much interested in solidarity as you are in being rescued from the consequences of your own actions in many cases.
Okay, that's super interesting and really helpful. And I think so one of the questions that I kind of had as I was reading through the book is kind of like, well, who are your interlocutors? So when you're saying like, well, feminists or like mainstream feminists or something, you'll see like, who are you thinking about and who do you kind of think you're in dialogue with? It's useful to hear kind of the mundane example in some ways, because I think, you know, I'm a political theorist by training, and so when I think of solidarity, I'm thinking of like very maybe like academically inflated concepts of solidarity, and not these kind of like everyday interactions where people are like, why are you in solidarity with me trying to conscript these children into teaching my children Spanish? I'm curious if so for you, solidarity is a word that, like, you know, the way you said it is like that only gets deployed when people are looking for help, right? It's not a continual practice. And I'm curious if you think that there are other words like, you know, like solidarity, and I think most obviously feminism, if you think that word is too freighted by the ways in which people try to use it for their own benefit to still be useful.
So I want to take feminism back. I both want to take it back from the people who use it as a pejorative and from the people who make it so easy for it to be used as a pejorative, right? And that's not a knock on womanism. It's just that feminism is such a useful term that has been besmeared, besmirched, beaten, bludgeoned into being whatever people want it to be, right? And so like some years ago, I did this radio show. We were talking about police brutality and all of these other things. This was around the time of the Ferguson uprising. And the host at one point during a break looks at me and says, we've got to get you away from that feminism stuff and get you talking about issues that affect Black people. And I asked him if Black women had suddenly stopped being people. And you could tell he didn't know where he was going with that. And so in terms of who I'm in conversation with, I'm both in conversation with people who theoretically agree with me in the main part, as well as with people who fervently disagree with me, and hopefully with people who hadn't necessarily thought about these things in this way. I took the approach that I wanted the book to be as accessible as possible, because I know for me, when I first came to academic feminism, I needed a dictionary to figure out what I was reading.
Yes.
And I have a master's degree from DePaul. I'm not a stupid girl. I still needed a dictionary to look up like praxis. There is a word that if we were going to talk about words I have no use for, praxis is on the list. We could just say practice, we could. Right? But also I think in terms of terminology, the words, the correct words, the way we shape language, all of that matters, don't get me wrong, but also what is least harmful changes as we grow and as we know more. And sometimes I think we get too hung up on the concept that this word is all important and must stick around, or this word must be discarded, as opposed to treating words like what they are, what to me as a writer, which is tools. We can make them be useful. We can make them be helpful. We just have to change the behaviors around them, right? Now, full disclosure, my understanding of English as a construct, that was not an English major, took a lot of English classes, is that English is really just a composite of languages that got together in back alley after being shoved in a bag by somebody, shaken up, and then fought its way out, and is now shambling around, stealing vocabulary wherever it can, and creating grammatical rules on a whim. So if that's how the rest of English works, we might as well make it work for terms around feminism and class and race, right? Irregardless wasn't a word, except now irregardless is a word.
Is it actually? Has it been included
Yes,
in like?
yes.
Wow, this is a great day. Who knew? Okay, I just learned something. I had no idea that irregardless had ascended to the echelons of words.
Yes.
I am that's super. It's first of all, I so resonate with that. I remember my first like week in graduate school, I was like, oh, I'll just look up some of these words that I don't know. And like, there just aren't definitions for like, if you try to look up praxis, like good luck, like they're like, you just have to feel the definition, it's not enough to, you have to intuit your way to the definition. Okay, that's really useful to hear. And I think it sort of leads me then to this question about, so you talk at the very in the introduction about your grandmother and other women that you described as feminists, but who would not have used the word feminism to describe themselves. And so I'm curious, like what you basically I'm curious, like what the phrasing of hood feminism does for you, and like in your sense of why the hood is such a useful place to theorize feminism from, given that you say like kind of throughout the book that hood feminism applies to the suburbs, it applies to rural areas, applies to the reservation, and of course is a call on mainstream feminism. So like what is so useful about the hood as we're thinking through feminism and its potential meanings?
So I grew up in Hyde Park, a neighborhood that is now a Tony Chicago neighborhood. It wasn't when I was a kid, right? And you will now see people say that Black folks who live there do so because they want to be next to white people, but I'm old. So I remember when there weren't that many white people and they moved there, right? And I remember it becoming desirable, right? But before it was desirable, the hood was this place to avoid. It was bad over there. Those people are over there, right? All of those narratives happening outside, because I didn't grow up on the part next to the lake. I grew up on the part closer to Robert Taylor, which was the projects that used to be there, right? And yet what I remember is that was my home. That was my community. It's still my home, right? Even if I leave, I go back. That's where I learned how to make friends. I climbed those trees. I swung in those swings. I messed up my knees and drove my grandmother crazy about tights. There's a pair of lace tights that I will have to explain when I get to the pearly gates. And also where people knew me, right? They knew my name, they knew my grades. Anyone who's grown up in a tight-knit inner city neighborhood has, my grandmother was the old lady in the window that knew everybody's business. That's who I was raised by, okay? But these were people who knew who my people were. Oh, you're Curtis Campbell's granddaughter. Oh, you're Dorothy's daughter. To give you an example of how tightly woven that neighborhood was for years, after I had my oldest child, in my community, it's pretty normal. A lot of Black American communities from certain parts of the South, for you to stay home for the first 4 weeks or 6 weeks after birth. You literally don't leave the house. My grandmother told me to keep my behind at home, and I wanted ice cream, so I went to the store. The cashier, mind you, I was 24 years old, 24, looks at me, looks at the baby and says, "You are out here with a fresh baby." Oh. She waves at one of the livery drivers. For those of you not from Chicago, livery drivers were guys who were Uber before there was Uber or Lyft, right? She waves him over. She calls my grandmother on the phone, then hands him the phone. "Yes, ma'am. Of course, Miss Campbell." I'm standing there like I am a grown-up. The woman behind me is like, "Girl, You in trouble? Got that baby out here. I am being like lectured by my community about this, right?
Mm.
And it's embarrassing, but also it is love, right? Why would you have to come out? What could possess you? Why didn't you call someone? We would have just brought you what you needed. And she hands me the phone. This man, whose name was Mr. McCurtis, no, I don't know this man. My grandmother tells me to get in his car. He's going to take us home. He's going to be who I call from now on if I need groceries picked up.
Mm.
He drives me, mind you, I didn't go far. I went 5 blocks. He drives me 5 blocks, 24, right? I have my groceries. He carries my groceries into my house, fusses, and then comes back later with soup his wife sent over because I had just had a baby. And of course she's hungry, but she probably don't have the right food, right? And this was all poor people. I was poor. They were poor. We were all poor, right? But this is a community that takes care of each other, because what happens in the hood and a lot of low-income communities is that you're taking care of each other. Whether that is rural or a reservation or the barrio, people are feeding each other, they're having work parties, they all know each other. It is a tightly woven network. And it may not be great all the time. It's certainly not great to be poor or deal with bad landlords. It doesn't want a dozen other things that happen, but it's a community. And if we were treating more places like that, we would probably have a better outcome. Because even though I didn't have maternity leave in structure, I had maternity leave in effect, right? My grandmother was too sick to come over and see about the baby and fuss because she didn't know already, but she could make sure someone did. And I did get the rest. I did get to eat the food and the ice cream and all the other snacks. And do you know this man who I'd never remembered seeing before in my life? He came by regularly to pick up my grocery order for the next 4 months. You need to be taking that baby out. The weather is bad. It's raining. It's cold. It's whatever. So I think that is a level of caring we could show to each other. We don't, but we could, which is one of the reasons I theorized from this place.
That's really wonderful. That and also super resonates with me. I'm from a part of Newark, and a couple of months ago when my grandmother died, like I don't even know how people started to find out, right? But people just show up at your door. They're like bringing food. They're like, oh, I heard like she took me in, she did this for me, like, and I think that really resonates with me as a description of like the usefulness of the hood as like a framework for thinking through feminism and what feminism should do for people. So one of the things that kind of puts me in the headspace of is that, you know, a lot of what your book seems to be, a lot of what it seems like you're concerned about is sort of popular discourse, right? So you're interested in the way people are talking in like kind of the everyday, the way people are talking in the media. And so I'm curious, like, why that for you is such important feminist terrain, right? So one way that you might think about feminism and like where feminism should live, right, is in that kind of like rarefied academic space we were talking about at the very beginning, where we're theorizing the materialist roots of sexual oppression. But for you, like, there's actually a kind of interaction that people are having on a more regular basis. And so I'm curious for you, kind of the import of those moments.
I think when we talk about wider societal problems, as though society at all, removed from us, the person, has made a decision, has done a thing, we also kind of absolve ourselves for our role in society. We absolve our friends, our neighbors, people we work with, whatever, for their role. But the things that we're talking about don't happen because of an intrusion from outer space or a different dimension. People are making decisions, right? I had this back and forth on Twitter a while ago about new city design and how people are saying, well, we want to make places less car dependent, but they're not structuring in better public transportation, right? had a bunch of urban planners insisting that, this was asking too much. And I was like, so no, these two concepts go together because the very real people, like I understand you have a picture and now your picture is real and it is very exciting. I'm not saying it's not exciting, but the very real failure of the thing you have built will come in the part where people can't get back and forth, right? Well, this is a walkable neighborhood, but people don't just live in their neighborhood. And so we're having like these two different conversations. They were really having a high end sort of city planning conversation. And I was talking about the people who would live in the city, in the neighborhood, who would transit around. And one of the reasons I focus on is a lot of times we make policy based off of here as opposed to here. But here is where policy has an impact. And I would like us to be having the conversation about how people are involved and also thinking of ourselves as the people who function and make up a society so that we could see some kind of progress instead of expecting another intrusion from the outside world to fix everything.
So your book goes through a series of different kind of policy realms, including gun violence, hunger, housing, education, reproductive justice. I'm curious if you think that there's one of those topics where the gap is especially wide, and you think that kind of the disconnect between policymakers and policies experienced on the ground is especially in need of a kind of hood feminist view.
So there's a couple places. One is gun violence. America's drunk, right? And I'm someone who owns guns. I like going to the range to shoot. And I still can tell you honestly that there's something happening in the psyche of the politicians who are in bed with the NRA that I can never explain, because there's no amount of money that would have me able to look at the death rates and then be like, yes, I will take your check to do nothing about this, right? And yes, politicians in America are for sale. This is true everywhere. I'm from Chicago. Side note, before anyone decides that it's about a particular party, we send our governors to jail. It's like our favorite thing. We've sent 7 so far. This one doesn't look like he's going to jail, but I'm waiting.
It's too early to tell, obviously.
Wait, like I'm confused because I've gotten into the habit. I'm used to it now. Our mayor, Chicago's mayor, on the other hand, that night in handcuffs, right? But one of the things where I feel like there's a big gap is that everybody keeps talking about guns as though they don't know what is happening, right? Well, gun laws haven't worked. Gun laws don't work because gun laws in Illinois have absolutely nothing to do with gun laws in Indiana or Wisconsin or Missouri, or frankly, outside the city of Chicago, right? Guns aren't like fruit. They don't go bad if they cross state lines. So if you can't buy a gun in this place, but you can buy a gun in 37 places around it, this place's laws won't make any difference, right? And by the same token, the other place I fall into that is with hunger, poverty in general, hunger in specific, because we also talk about food like we don't have enough of it. We have tons of it, right? I'm a very Midwestern girl. I go to things like corn festivals, right? The Sweet Corn Festival. They have those festivals because they're basically giving away the excess produce, right? They want you to buy it in the store and whatever, but also for like $1, you can get like 4 ears of corn. There's not a reason that we can't get affordable produce elsewhere, affordable food, safe food around the country, except we never bothered to develop a plan. And also we kind of resent the idea that people might eat without earning their food, right? Because we structure work and poverty as a punishment. So when you have politicians who say things like low-income kids could clean the lunchroom to pay for their lunch, I don't know if it's drugs. I don't know if you had a bowl of brain tumors for breakfast, but there's something fundamentally lacking in you as a person, right? And that is by proxy also the thing with poverty. We don't want to change any of the standards around poverty, but last time I checked, the metrics I think are something like $20 an hour is what we were considering a living wage. Anyone who has rented anything or gone grocery shopping recently can tell you that $20 an hour was a living wage 4 years ago. It might have been close to a living wage a year ago. now, even with all of my success, me and my husband both have, income streams, blah, blah, blah. There are still moments in the grocery store where I stand there just like my grandmother and go, now, did they actually raise the price on? Right? It was milk, as a matter of fact. I saw a $9 jug of milk and I had to stand there and talk to everything. And because I have a 15-year-old who would like to consume food. But like I emotionally was like, this milk is $9. And then my very next thought, as I begrudgingly paid like $8.50 for the milk or whatever it actually was what do you do if you're still on food stamps? Because food stamps is not going to cover $9 milk. And I know I used to have them, right? WIC is not going to cover all of these things. It can't. And we've never restructured those things to match inflation. So those are the places where I just get very like, the politician who wrote this is a person who thinks bananas cost a penny. That's the only explanation, right?
That's really, I mean, yes to all of that. I think one of the things that kind of like puts me in the headspace of is like, I'm curious what you, so one of the things that kind of occurred to me as I was reading Hood Feminism is that I think one of like really incredible things about the book is that you're trying to say that all these topics that are usually separated out, right? So housing policy is usually a thing that like urban planners study, right? And you're trying to say, no, they're actually all interrelated and actually are all meaningfully feminist topics. And so I'm curious what for you, what kind of thing feminism is? Like, is it an identity? Is it the kind of thing you put on a shirt? Is it a mode of critique? Is it a movement? Like, what is it in a kind of like material term? Yeah.
I think what it currently is too often is something you put on a shirt and an identity. I think what I would like to see it be is more of a movement, and that's not to say that there aren't parts of this that's been a movement, but more of a movement that addresses, I'm just going to break it down as what I think it should be. It should be a movement that addresses the very basic material needs of people so that we could fight for this better world, right? Like we didn't get the flying cars future. I'm not going to get to go into a holodeck and battle it out with a creature. Instead, we got the version from every bad dystopian novel. I never wanted to be in the Mad Max version, right? None of us wanted to go to the Thunderdome, but that seems to be the road we're determined to attach ourselves to, right? What is the worst way we can handle some things? Let's do that, right? And if you are someone right now thinking, well, no, it's not the worst, I'm going to tell you that almost 1 million people have died in the US from COVID. They announced that. We have not just the vaccine, we have vaccines, plural. They're free. At this point, I'm in a county that has all but hung from random rafters and shot you in the neck with it, right? Like they're setting up 6-day-a-week clinics, all of these things. We're not bright enough to wear masks. And before someone says it's just American, I will point you to what's happening in Ottawa right now and what has happened in various countries, including England. We don't want to wear masks. We don't want to get vaccinated. We don't want to be inconvenienced, but we want it to go away, right? And I think feminism, in some ways, its failures have tied into how we got here. Because if you were talking to feminism about things like the anti-vax movement before COVID, well, those are parental choices. So those are parental choices for people who cannot make choices for themselves. And those kids are going to have to pay for it, right? And a lot of those choices are being made by women. So suddenly we need to support women without questioning what choices of women were making. The only choice we wanted to debate was whether or not you chose to have children, not what you were doing for the caring, feeding, and raising of those kids. When it comes to what I would like to see in terms of feminist futures, it's not that I want to police how people raise their kids exactly, but I do want us to make sure that young women, young girls, we all have rights, and that those rights are protected, including sometimes the right to say like, hey, this person I drew in the genetic lottery is maybe not making the best decisions for me. And we could maybe have a mechanism for that, right? And I think sometimes we think, well, as long as I say I'm feminist and I don't say that women shouldn't vote or shouldn't work, my work is done. But maybe we should be thinking about the other work, the work of making sure everyone has the right to vote. Everyone can get hired if they want to be hired. Everyone can eat, right? Because we keep saying that we want a better future, but people who are busy trying to survive can't work towards a better future. All they can do is work towards staying alive.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that the watered down kind of Mad Max version of feminism has proliferated so far? You know, like reading your book, it the version of feminism, the feminist future that you're outlining feels so seductive and like attractive, and like, of course, why wouldn't anybody want that? And so I'm curious why you think that thinner, less robust version of feminism has flourished so widely.
So here's where I make some people mad. Because it's easier to do nothing than it is to do something. A. B. Feminism has never dealt with its racism. It's never dealt with transphobia, homophobia, internalized misogyny, ableism, like you pick it. Feminism has really avoided confronting it. And the answer, whenever anyone has brought it up, has always been, don't be divisive. Women don't have the right yet. Women aren't equal yet. And the real subtext is white women don't have the right, right? And unfortunately, as we, I think, are seeing people realize, ignoring what was happening to everyone else doesn't mean that white supremacy will be kind to white women, right? The very function of white supremacy is to be destructive. And as long as feminism wasn't interested in combating white supremacy, because let's be honest also here, some feminist leaders were racist, right? Some of them thought that white supremacy would protect them. You can look as far back as Rebecca Latimer Felton, who was an advocate of lynching, right? To see this woven through the movement from its theoretical roots. I mean, the theoretical roots are this mimicking the rights other women had, but we'll get to that another time. You see this over and over again. As long as I've got mine, everybody else can figure out how to get theirs. There's always been will you wait your turn for liberation, for freedom, for safety, right? Even early suffrage arguments centered often, especially this Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, and Susan B. Anthony, around the idea that white women needed to get the vote so that if Black men got the vote, white supremacy would be preserved. And you can look up them saying this in their speeches with those exact words. So now we're in a place where when you never built it right from the beginning and you pushed out critics throughout, surprise, the bell that rings isn't just bad for those people over there, for those women. One of the things that COVID revealed very rapidly is the social safety nets that low-income women were saying, hey, we need to support these, we need to keep these, and people kept saying that wasn't really a feminist issue. It was a poverty issue. Mm-hmm. I think we've all seen those articles from white women who left their jobs saying, oh, wait, there's no mechanism to provide childcare so I can stay at work. I've had to close my company, I've lost all of this footing. How do I get it back? Well, the answer was that you needed to support the things you didn't need, even when you didn't need them, so that they would be there when you need them.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I think the COVID example is perfect, because I think there's so many people who are, you know, economically secure, who are middle and upper middle class, who are suddenly realizing that it's very difficult to try to manage work and childcare at the same time, right? That's not. I feel like there's so many people I know who are like, oh, my kids don't understand that they can't hang out with me because I'm at work. And there's just this point, it's like, well, I know lots of poor children who know you just need to be quiet when your parents are at work because they're at work. And that's just like an experience that you just have, you know, it's like a growing up, so you gotta work with your parents. So, but that kind of, okay, so you have this one piece called Fear and Feminism, and you talk about the Network of Enlightened Women and like conservative feminist organizations. You say that, you know, it's a feminism that requires no empathy, compassion, care, or concern for other people, but it's still technically feminism. And so I'm curious why you're not kind of, I think the way most people might go about thinking about that is, oh, well, that's just like a false consciousness. Like people are just mistaken about what feminism is, or they're enacting it incorrectly. And I'm curious why you don't take that route. Like why, right? So what the advantage of still counting those people as feminists is?
Because they're shaping feminist policy. They're showing up and voting booths. Feminism guarantees their right to do harm. And we've seen mainstream feminist voices rise, especially for white, not quite feminist women with big platforms. And every time it's, well, women have to support women. And it's like, well, babe, I don't know what you don't understand, because she's gonna stab you in the back in 4 minutes, right? And sometimes it does feel like having a conversation. Some of you will have had this conversation with your mother about a friend, an aunt, grandma, someone who will have told you, that little girl, leave her the hell alone. And you were certain that this was your buddy, this was your friend, everything was great. And then when it blew up in your face, you had to sit and look at that relative who was like, okay, well now baby, we're gonna fix it. That's why I told you not everybody is your friend, right? That's what it feels like this conversation needs to be with the broader feminist movement. Because if we keep saying, oh, well, they're not feminists, it absolves feminism from ever addressing how they propped up, built up, protected, and insulated those voices until those voices were a problem.
That's really great. I'm super persuaded by that, because I think when I was reading the piece on Karen Agnes, I was like, well, why not just think like, oh, well, she's just mistaken about what feminism entails. But I think you're drawing our attention to something that's really important, which is that like there's not just this concept of feminism as it's like kind of defined in books and in text, but there's also feminism as it's living in the world, and as people are interacting with it, are taking up its mantle, are you know, trying to decide what it is and what it should be moving forward. That's really great. Thank you. I'm curious if you think there are any perils to expanding the concept of feminism too far. Like, are there things that you think should not rightly be counted as feminist issues?
I think if it affects women, and by women I mean cis and trans, right, genderqueer, whatever, this is a catch-all term. It's really difficult to say that it's not an issue, because it's 51% of the world's population. What issue are we going to sort of say doesn't impact, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm gung-ho for riding into the manosphere and figuring out what's gone wrong there. I will happily leave the folks carried with a shot behind. I will happily leave folks who don't want to move forward behind. But I think for people who are acting in good faith and facing issues, whether they're ones I face or not, I can't really say it's not a feminist issue just because it's not one I experience, right? First of all, gender and race enter into every aspect of someone's life, and you know, sort of your presentation, all of these things. And I think when we try to silo it out as like feminist, not feminist, we're saying to some people, there's no help for you here, but we will call you if we need help. Thanks.
Yeah, so kind of getting back to the piece you were saying at the beginning about solidarity and like, well, who is it for and who is being served by it? Oh, that's really great. There are a number of questions in the chat that I've seen like popping up as we've been talking, and I know we're coming close to time, so I'm going to turn things over to Alice McCrum to lead us.
Thank you, Kierstan. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to hear you, to have you back as an interviewer. It's just mesmerizing watching you think and then ask your questions. So thank you. We'll bring you back at the end, so please don't go anywhere. It's true that, and if you've joined us late, hello, welcome to Evenings with an Author at the American Library in Paris. I'm Alice McCrum, Programs Manager. This is Mikki Kendall, the author of Hood Feminism, the book we've been talking about this evening. We are now, it's true, turning to the questions and comments section of tonight's event. So if you haven't posted your question or comment, please, I do urge you to go ahead and post it. We have about 20 minutes, so hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. Just before we do, I want to note, and I always so lovely to see this, the international array of listeners and viewers. We have people from Paris, people from the French Alps, Virginia, Los Angeles, Lapland, North Carolina, St. Louis, Missouri, St. Cloud in Paris, Portugal. Voila, that's already a vast array of places. So hello to everyone. Okay, so there is a question from Orlaith, who writes, question for Mikki about abolition feminism and what her view is on that. White feminism and carceral feminism are under the spotlight recently. What are your thoughts on how policing and imprisonment are often weaponized by white feminism?
Okay, so I have to say that I want to go to Lapland, so I'm having a moment. I want to go. Trying to
There'll be more snow there. I mean,
I know, but then I can see the northern lights. If there's a trade-off here where there's like reindeer and northern lights, and I could try some things. So here's the thing about carceral feminism. Full disclosure, I am not an abolitionist. I am a reductionist. I think that there are some crimes for which we don't have any solution other than removing that person from the access to the broader population. Those crimes are all violent. And I'm not even saying that removal should be permanent. I would be happy with a different treatment-based model. I just don't, as somebody who has been through some things, think that everybody needs to be able to go outside and interact with everybody else. Some folks need to time out. But I think that we have transformed a model that was supposed to deal with people who were a threat to others to a model where we, if someone inconveniences us, has less money than us, has beliefs we don't agree with, yada, yada, right? Like there's a whole structure, especially in the US, where mass incarceration has mushroomed that makes it very clear our current system doesn't work. I think one of the ways that we see this is when we're talking about things like the school to prison pipeline in the US. I went to a predominantly Black, by predominantly, I mean 99.9% Black school. We had one white teacher, right? I did dumb things while I was in that school, including once accidentally setting the science lab wall on fire because it turns out if you're doing an experiment that involves boiling alcohol, you should make sure the outside of the beaker is dry, just for science. I didn't go to jail. It didn't cost my family a bunch of money. I got a lecture. I had to help clean up. Mrs. Archibald probably lost another like inch of her hairline in that process. She was her science teacher. Prayers to her, because she had a lot to do. But I think we have made of the prison system and of the legal system a weapon. And I would love to see us unload that proverbial gun. And this is true in the US and outside. I've seen models in other places that are frankly far more humane than anything the US has ever been able to structure. Part of that is not just because the cruelty is the point, that is definitely part of the US's problem. The other problem is that the US has private prisons. So incarcerating people here is an investment. And I don't think private prisons should be legal. I don't think that you should be able to sentence the vast majority of people for nonviolent crimes to incarceration at all. Restitution, community service should be where we stop that thing. For the people who are left, and when I say nonviolent crimes, I mean drugs and all of those things. I think that these are things that are symptoms of an illness, right? But when we are talking about someone who is a rapist, a murderer, a serial child predator, okay, fine. Then we have to come up with a solution. But that solution also doesn't have to look like throwing someone in a pit and closing the door and walking away. That could actually be a therapeutic setting, which is what I think would be far more productive and far more useful, both for the good of the individual and for society as a whole. I think white feminism has had a really good weapon to use for a really long time, going all the way back to lynching, and doesn't know how to let go of it.
Thank you. Let's broach another enormous topic, one of capitalism. So Ganima asks, do you think feminism can be successful in a capitalist society? These are enormous questions to ask at the end, but why not?
Why not? Why not? I think it can be as successful as anything else in capitalist society, and by which I mean capitalism is structured in such a way that it limits your capacity to be a fully realized person who doesn't make money, and making money a central part of your identity. Now, full disclosure, I think human greed is really more of an obstacle than a particular financial structure, because we seem every time we come up with other financial structures to pivot them right back to some people have the most and some people have the least, because greed is a thing that we do. We are not necessarily altruistic as a species. And so I think feminism could be more successful than it is. It could be far more helpful than it is. Do I think that any system inside a capitalist society is going to be perfect? No. Do I think that you can achieve full equality in a capitalist society? Also, no, because the entire function of capitalism is to make sure that some people have more and some people have less. I am not, however, certain that we have ever warmed up to the idea of sharing, no matter what we learned in kindergarten.
Thank you. That was a fairly short response to an enormous, a pithy response to an enormous question. This is a question from Kat, who I think kind of departing from Kierstan's questions about the vast scope of your definitions of feminism and solidarity, asks you, Mikki, do you think that the concept of intersectionality still has weight in feminism, or has it been turned into more of a buzzword adopted by organizations and corporations in performance?
I think the term has weight. I think it still has plenty of use, so to speak, in how we approach things. I think the concept being co-opted was almost unavoidable. I know of no concept that has been introduced into the wider world. And this kind of goes back to my point about capitalism, right? We're trying to do this thing where we consider all of these aspects of a person and how society views them and how that impacts their life. Great. And commodification shows up in her pretty pink dress and says, let me make some money off of it. Now I'm as guilty of this as the next person. Obviously, my book is available for sale. I don't think that that makes the contents of my book bad. I just think that we are also operating in a situation where we are going to have to deal with capitalism and the attempt to make a profit off of literally anything. Because to be fair, I recently saw something where people were selling edible dirt as a cure for COVID. So people will literally, capitalism will make people sell literally anything. I mean, anything.
So where did you see this?
It is an MLM-ish thing. The FTC recently went after them, no less. Hold on, I will find the link, because I saw this and was like, this is dirt. Like, I had a very much my grandmother's response of like, but baby, that's dirt. I'm sorry, my thing is super loud. I know.
No. Well, I guess we'll wait for the link.
Oh yeah, no. It was actually. Do you know they have edible dirt for cakes?
No, I mean I was always told not to eat dirt, even though I we all wanted to, because we thought it was going to be like chocolate.
I don't know what to tell you, because now there's a whole thing about growing and eating your own vaccines.
Gosh.
I have no answers for you.
Zakaya,
yep. Oh, it's a whole video.
Okay.
I'll find it and send it to you, because there is a whole apparently there is a whole thing about how to make your own dirt.
Gosh. I'm sure there is. I mean, nothing will pass me these days. So you were saying edible dirt.
Yes. And so when you start to think that people will make anything a profit margin, right? And we can tie this in.
Even on edible dirt.
Even dirt. And yep, somebody has found the link I was trying to find. Thank you, Toya. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But it is one of those things where there's no way to avoid commodification. Not sure there's ever been a way to avoid commodification, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the proverbial bathwater here. As a concept, it's very useful. I think we should be applying it in terms of how we write policy. I would love it if advertisers weren't also jumping on it, but advertisers will, as we see, jump on anything, including edible dirt. So I think that we can only approach all of these terms as we will use it for what we intend to use it for, and we will try to drown out the people who are trying to make it into commodity.
Okay, this is great, because this touches at a question that I had for you, Mikki, which is that you just described how you yourself are kind of inscribed in this tradition of commodification just because you're selling your book in a capitalist society. Fantastic. But how do you feel, or did because in the book, for people who haven't read it, and if you haven't read it, you know, one of the points of these things is so that you go out and order the book. So please, here it is. Go get yourself a copy. But I was wondering, did you, since you knew that obviously it would kind of go out onto the market, as it were, and be sold and be talked about, you knew that you would be doing these kind of events. This isn't your first book. Did you pause at all before you added in these kind of much more personal parts of your story? So you talk, you know, very vividly about your family members. You talk very personally about some of your own challenges that you faced in your life. How did you decide what to put in and what to keep out? And how have you felt over the course of, you mentioned before the call, so many Zoom events and so many discussions that are so publicly seen? How do you feel about sharing your life in such an open mass market, if you like?
I had decided when I did this that I had already decided before this that being ashamed of things that happen to you is useless. In many ways, shame is a useless emotion. I'm not saying you shouldn't feel ashamed of the things you did wrong, but if something bad happens to you or you struggle, there's really no shame in it. That's just life, right? I also decided that the opinions of people I don't know and probably wouldn't like were not going to matter to me. Doesn't mean people have not had things to say. Periodically, there's some special soul who likes to leave me comments that my kids are appalled by me or my husband doesn't like me or whatever. And it's going to be the hill they die on, I guess. But I count on what is actually in front of me and not what a random troll on the internet says as how I should feel about things. Do I know that people probably were going to judge me and some of the choices I made? Absolutely. But I'm also here to be like, listen, if you did make mistakes in your 20s, congratulations. But I would love to know what rock you lived under, because that's just not how your 20s work, right? Like, and then we just carry on.
Good to hear. No, but there are the choices that you make, right? But then there are your family members, and people are just talking about them, strangers you know.
So here's the thing. I gave no one names, right? I gave no last names, none of that, because one of the things I do on social media and elsewhere, I have signed up for the shit show that may be a day in my life. They have not. So you will notice that either I have their permission, my kids decide what of them is shown or not shown, and so does my spouse. But they have nicknames to this day. I use husbands for my husband, right? My kids are kid number 1 and kid number 2. Kid number 1 is 22, and we still are, right? Other relatives are either deceased, and in my grandmother's case, she wouldn't give a shit about what people on the internet thought of her or strangers or whatever. That's where I got this attitude from. My aunt is the only living person I refer to. A couple people have asked, because I don't really talk about my parents, and there are reasons for that, right? They're not dead, they exist, but I don't talk about them and I don't identify them because they don't need the internet in their life, kind of a thing. We have crafted, I think, a very nice wall of insulation. Plus, I was raised by assholes. So if the internet or whoever does decide to contact my relatives, good luck. I hope you came prepared for what might come out, because I was raised by the kind of people who could outcuss a merchant marine. So.
It's fantastic. I have a question from Toya Aya. I hope I'm pronouncing that as well right. Probably not. I'm sorry. Who asks, where do you think the breakdown of how we view feminism as a concept happened historically, and what can we do to not repeat the same mistakes of our past?
So the breakdown actually happened, I feel like, from the beginning, and then it keeps happening, right?
Okay.
Misogyny plays a role.
Yeah.
I talked a little bit about the history and the suffragette movement, but also I think because so much of feminist history takes place during Jim Crow in America, and during other periods of great racial strife, among other things, we are really still in its infancy in terms of a structured movement with a name. But women have fought for their rights all along. And we have seen in multiple societies that misogyny is as big of a force as racism, right? It is really one of those things where the idea that half of the population would be equal to the other half finds really upsetting sometimes. So I think that when we're talking about it, we're also talking about the ways that misogyny teaches us not to value ourselves, not to value other women, not to value the concepts I'm talking about here, because much like white supremacy, and these two things go hand in hand, it relies on something like feminism not existing. In some ways, feminism is an eternal rebellion against a desired state of subjugation of half of the vote, right? And I know there are people going to say, well, so-and-so that I know, and name a man here, isn't like that. And he probably isn't. But we're talking about everybody, not just people that.
Okay, this is the final question that I had for you, in part because I just last week interviewed Rebecca Hall. I don't know if anyone has read this fantastic book, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, which is a graphic novel, and she uses her PhD thesis to write, the research is based on her PhD thesis, and I'm aware, and I said this in the introduction, Mikki, that you wrote a graphic novel in 2019 called Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists, and I'm really interested in the question of form here. Did you feel that why turn to prose for this book, and at any point did you think, well, this story might be better told in the form of a graphic novel?
I actually wrote those books at the same time because I am ridiculous, and don't be me.
Brilliant, brilliant, and prolific. I just offer an alternative.
I'm just saying, in general, if you have a book come out in November, you don't want one coming out in February. These are choices in your schedule that you shouldn't make. But one of the reasons I felt like it was good to sort of have the conversation in multiple formats is because I think that entering in the graphic novel space, you're going to reach a certain category of people. Hood feminism will reach the people who don't read graphic novels, will reach people in the academy in a way that Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists wouldn't, but also that I feel like we can never have too many conversations about what women have done, about history, about feminism, about race, about class, about housing, about hunger. And I wanted to show that these issues are frankly global and that they span the breadth of human history, because there's also a tendency to be like, oh, the halcyon days of yore, when these things were the problem. What days were those, right? There's currently a resurgence of interest in the idea of a 1950s traditional housewife happening in the US. That resurgence is tied to a bunch of white supremacist jargon. You can figure out who's pushing it. But also when you start talking about that history and what followed that history, you realize that people are basing it off a TV show, because the visual has never been of what actually happened to women in the 50s or after the 50s in that model, right? I wanted to make sure that I made visible and real in terms of the graphic all of these faces from history, because the way we teach history means that it's really easy to lie about it.
Mm.
I wanted to make it so that it was a book people would go back to.
Mm.
And then I wanted to put it in prose so that this was also a book people would engage with later, right? People tend to think of graphics as being for kids. Not that they are. I am a person who writes comics. Like, no.
Yeah.
But I wanted the kids to read it. I wanted the older people to read it, and I wanted them to have a conversation.